Good evening on a beautiful, beautiful day in Toronto. Welcome to the TIFF Bell Lightbox. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Michelle Lovegrove Thompson. I'm the head of the Film Reference Library here at TIFF. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to tonight's special event, The Bloody Brood with Peter Roffman and Jason Pichonsky. To begin, we would like to acknowledge that tonight's event is taking place on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of Credit First Nation and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land and with the community as we work toward the truth of and reconciliation with our colonial past and present. As a charitable organization, we'd like to thank our donors and members for making TIFF's year-round programming and educational initiatives possible. On behalf of TIFF, I would also like to thank our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oreal Paris, and Visa, our public supporters, Ontario Creates and the Canada Council for the Arts, as well as the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, and the City of Toronto. So tonight's event, sort of an annual tradition in which the Film Reference Library, as holders of TIFF's Audiovisual Archive, we select a film to celebrate the UNESCO World Day for Audiovisual Heritage. It's an annual global event celebrated by museums and cinematheques and archives around the world, which aims to raise awareness of the need for film preservation and the conservation of our shared audiovisual history. Our special guests, Peter Roffman and Jason Pichonsky, will be up here after the screening to discuss the 2K digital restoration that you're about to see. This is the world premiere of the 2K version, and it utilized elements from Library and Archives Canada and interneg from the BFI, and missing footage found at the UCLA Film and Television Archive. And just as a side note, as this film was shot in Toronto in 1959, I just want to take the opportunity to let you know that an exhibition also just opened in the Film Reference Library that explores representations of Toronto on film, and it'll be on till December, so there's lots of time. If you want to also check that out, it's up on the 4th floor. So please stick around for the Q&A after the screening, and also Peter will be selling and signing his book, Dear Guelda, The Death and Life of Pioneering Canadian Filmmaker Julian Roffman. So a lot of really exciting stuff for you guys tonight. Please enjoy, and let's go for it. Thanks. There's so many things I feel like we can talk about, both in terms of the content of the film. Because we're hosting this as part of AV Heritage Day, though, I'd like to start just with some more technical questions around the actual restoration. First of all, welcome, and thank you so much for making time to come and share this film with us. So one of the reasons that we chose this film is that we do have a 35mm print of this film in the library collection. And I was looking at programming it for October because it's also sort of close to Halloween as well, and it's kind of got this murder mayhem vibe going on. So I also recalled that you had been in touch with us about 2 or 3 years ago. You were trying to track down some missing footage because you were working on this 2K digital restoration. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about how that came about in the first place, the sort of what spurred you on to do the restoration, and then all of the different institutions that you approached to kind of recover that missing part. And which part is it that was the missing part? Many questions. It's on. Sean, can you bring up handhelds 1, 2, and 3, please? It should be. Yeah. He's got number 1, 2, and 3. Fabulous. Talk right into it, or you can use mine.
What was I going to say? How did we start? I know I wanted to see it in a better condition than what's been out there. So it's been kind of these gray market, black market like DVD television prints and stuff. And I started poking around and found out that they had at the BFI, they had a pretty high quality. It was actually a copy of it was a positive copy of the film, and a negative that they had made for the UK release, which was actually titled "The Telegraph Said Death." So that big beatnik reveal was the UK version, and then we also had pulled a more complete version of the film from the Library and Archives of Canada. And the piece that was missing in both of those prints was the part with Francis directing the soap commercial and the line about the gorilla. Oddly enough, because that actually does exist in other copies that are out there.
Yep. I don't know, Peter, also if you wanted to weigh in on that, or maybe if you can talk about your relationship and how you guys came together to do the project, or did you already work on other things before?
Well, about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. It's been a while ago. Somebody asked to come interview me for a book about Canadian horror films, and unbeknownst to me, he brought Jason along. And he didn't even bother telling me about it, and I was slightly taken aback. But then I quickly found that I sort of, quite like Jason, and sort of did an interview, a follow-up interview as well. And it just basically went from there. Jason then was asked by the 3D Film Archive. Yeah, by the 3D Film Archive to do extras for
the mask.
For the mask restoration, and he interviewed me for that on film, and we sort of became friends, I guess, sort of, and Jason's a terrific person, and to me, is doing something very important, which is helping to keep my father's memory alive. And so we were just talking about that, and I happened to have the rights to the not to the mask, which my father sold, but to the Bloody Brood, and we just took it from there. I wanted to point out one thing about the lost scene. My father, when he came to Canada in 1954, he was Canadian, but he'd lived in the United States for about approximately 20 years at that point. He was blacklisted, actually. He was working in film, documentary film, television, and he came here, and he was sold that there was going to be tons of work, and there wasn't, but he quickly built up Meridian Films, and he did it making TV commercials. So Francis, in a sense, is like a surrogate for my father.
And that soundstage that he was on, the soundstage that he shot on would have actually been the original studio, Meridian Studios, that Julian had worked in and built up.
Which sort of still exists on Woodbine Avenue at Mortimer. It's now a car repair shop.
It's a repair shop. I drive by it all the time.
If you could also just talk a little bit about your father's legacy sort of as a genre filmmaker. He's very early, so that's 1959. The Mask is 61, I believe. And that's not he didn't stick to that exclusively, obviously. And maybe, what do you think the impact of that legacy is for following? I think Canada has a really interesting niche in terms of genre filmmaking.
Okay. How do I put this politely? The film that my father is best known for, which is obviously the Mask, he had tremendously mixed feelings about. He came out of documentary, out of the Film and Photo League, which was for photographers and for documentary films with a social purpose. And he started in New York. He worked at the Film and Photo League. He worked on a famous sort of fictional short which Elia Kazan, I believe, appeared in, if I'm not mistaken, called Pie in the Sky. He was one of the cameramen on that, and he started making films for Consumers Union. He did a series of films called Getting Your Money's Worth, and what his interest was throughout his life was trying to actually make films about society and trying to improve the things. And he landed up coming to Canada, working in commercials, being complete. He also did a lot of documentaries, including he had worked with the National Film Board from 1941 to 1945, end of 45. And there's a photo in the lobby of one of the first films he did outside the film board after he left the film board. And anyways, like he wanted his dream was to become a feature filmmaker. And if anybody reads the book Dear Guelda, which is outside for sale, by the way, get my plug in. He longed to make films that had some importance socially, and it wasn't quite how it worked out. He landed up doing TV commercials. He did do all sorts of documentaries, continued to do documentaries. He worked with, among other people, with Eugene Shuftan, who's one of the greatest cinematographers of all time, worked with Marcel Carnet on Port of Shadows, worked with Fritz Lang on Metropolis, did the special effects for it, et cetera, Max Ophuls he made several films with, and he won the Oscar for The Hustler. And my father kept on trying to get feature films made. That was his dream. And he couldn't do it in the United States because he got blacklisted. He had been under contract briefly to Columbia, but he was a little too headstrong for the studio system. Anyways, he landed up here, and he landed up doing genre films, and he wasn't happy with it. But he loved only one thing that he loved about genre films. He loved the 3D sequences in The Mask, and that
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to actually throw open to the audience because we just have about 5 or 6 minutes left. Who has a question? I'm sure there's lots of percolating thoughts. At the back, Michelangelo. We have a mic coming to you, actually, if you could just hold on for 1 second.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much. We love the film, and we also love The Mask that was screened here a little while ago. I don't know the films of that period much, and I was curious how common it was to single out the beatniks as the evil criminals.
The beatniks in that era were sort of having a little bit of a moment. So this film was very much made for a commercial audience and for a U.S. audience. He was working with the Hal Roach Company on a script and on this film, and then the money dried up and he had everything ready to go, so he just kind of went forward and did it.
He had about, I think, approximately 6 weeks to get the film, the script in shape. The script was not in very good shape at all, according to him. And the first guy he hired was actually an advertising guy from McLaren advertising agency, I believe, who he had worked with on commercials. And then he brought in, and he wasn't happy with the script. He brought in somebody else who was Ben Kerner, a guy he worked with throughout his career from the States. And I recognized Ben's sort of florid prose, shall you say, in some of the dialogue.
Great. Any other questions? Oh yeah, we have one lined up at the back.
Thank you so much for being here. Is the actor who played Cliff any relation to Clark Gable? And and what's the casting decision on having Peter Falk playing, who was at the time unknown, to play the leading actor? Thank you.
Well, I'll take the Cliff.
Yeah, you do.
The Cliff one. Cliff is actually an actor named Jack Betts, who's still acting. He's still around. He's still doing Broadway and stuff as well. But for a brief period he's no relation to Clark Gable. For a brief period of time, he actually went over to Italy and made spaghetti westerns under the name Hunt Powers. So, and some of those are pretty good.
My dad liked two things about the Bloody Brood, and two things only. Number one was working with Eugene Shuftan on a feature film, and he was very proud of that. And the other thing was Peter Falk, working with Peter Falk, whom he considered that he discovered. Peter Falk, it turns out, had been in a small role, I think, in Wind Across the Everglades, was it?
Yeah.
But it was a very small role, and he thought Falk was an exciting actor. And in fact, within a year, he had been in Murder, Inc., and had been nominated for an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. The only problem he had with Falk was the glass eye, and he found in a lot of scenes the reflection the reflection off the glass eye caused them all sorts of headaches.
But in some ways, it actually adds to the menace of Nico.
Yeah, definitely.
We just have time for one more question. I saw there was a hand in the middle, or I thought there was, whoever that was. And just a reminder, so we will, Peter will be setting up to do a book signing outside, but lots of more time to chat one-on-one if you want to do that afterwards as well. So this will just be our last question.
Hi, I assume it's a wholly Canadian film. I don't know anything about distribution, but what were copies doing in the UCLA archives and the BFI?
Well, the BFI archive, it was being released. Obviously, some distributor had sold it. I think it was Julian, your dad, had taken it over to the UK for it to be released. So there is a version, and I don't really know where it played, but there is a UK certificate on it, and a new title called "The Telegraph Said Death," and a lot of stuff is missing from that particular print. Every time you see the guy with the fork, that's pretty much out. They wouldn't show the fork for some reason.
No forking allowed.
And then it did get released in the States. And at one point, your father told a story where he had taken it to a distributor and it had not been accepted. And he came back a year later and found out the distributor had actually been passing it around and been living off it for that year.
I'll just add as a quick note in terms of the distribution of film prints globally. A lot of times film archives will have 35 millimeters prints in their collections because they were the end of the line or they've just been donated sort of over decades. So there's a lot of spots where you'll find interesting films from another country or with German subtitles and you think, we don't even know where that came from. So that is interesting. And so sometimes you do find films from one country in another country and it was just sort of left over.
I just wanted to make one little point of interest about films in Toronto. I searched with my father. I was very young at the time, but I went location hunting, and we looked for alleyways for the final sequence. And in fact, that alleyway was within a few blocks of where we are right now, and that we searched first with Herb Alpert, who was the cameraman on The Mask, and with Schuffy, Eugene Schufftan, as well. And it landed up being right around here.
And we'll be doing a walking tour later.
Awesome. Well, we'll end on that note. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us. And we'll meet you outside the cinema for the book signing. Thanks very much for coming.